So excited to have Oliver Armstrong here with us today. I've heard legendary things about you, and so excited to have you on the podcast. You're passionate about talking about talent, building great teams, that founder journey, and what it's taught you about your own performance. Welcome to Work Measured.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure. Yeah.
Yeah, when we had lunch the first time with Tyson, and I remember you sharing your experience starting off in the intelligence area of the Marine Corps. And I found that really fascinating. And, maybe just jumping off there, like how much of that has actually carried through into how you think about products and how you think about decision making as a product and operations leader?
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's a great starting off point because I spent maybe about 8 years between getting out of the Marine Corps and doing intelligence and landing in tech and particularly product. And I'd like to think about that as, my first product job was actually really doing intelligence in the Marine Corps. And then after that, I was still in kind of the defense, intelligence space for a number of years. But, how I ended up even getting into tech in the first place was realizing that the thing I really liked with working with clients was crafting the products, how they worked into their strategic, vision for their companies and, how we could add benefit there. And so much of, my experience in those early days as a young Marine really carried over to, I think, what has led to a lot of success versus a product leader and then as a founder. On the leadership side alone, I think just having really great examples of the best leadership in the world, but also absolutely terrible leadership, being able to say, like, I don't want to be that guy and I do want to be that guy went a long ways, I think, to my philosophy as far as an operator. Particularly, that people are even today in kind of the AI LLM craze, like people are still an enormous component of being able to operate. And, that was, I think, probably the biggest long-term value takeaway was just managing personality, skill sets up and down the ladder.
The Marine Corps is probably one of these places where you had access to so much intelligence, but you still relied on humans and people to kind of make decisions off of them, right? And we're kind of seeing that with AI, where it's allowing us to look at so much data that we've never been able to kind of digest before. I now sort of see those parallels. Are you seeing those too?
Yeah, and I think it's used to have, like, in my day early, so this is also, 20 plus years ago at this point when I was, 18 kind of getting into the field. We had the general in the Marine Corps who was in charge of intelligence had this, even the early days of Google, of all things, right? Of just saying, like, hey, we have essentially, when it comes to intelligence, we have the Library of Congress, like, available to us. The problem is it's just scattered on the floor, right? And so in those days it was about how do we actually absorb the flow of so much information somewhat manually with some technology. I think that's obviously that story has changed a lot over 20 or 25 years. And now we're at a point where we've almost flipped to the other side, is how much information is now obscured because we're not actually even looking at it. And
Hmm.
AI is kind of making some of the judgment calls along the way. My personal philosophy also is that being able to pick up insights early in the process is almost the most important thing. This even comes to hiring and team. So when I was at Instapage, we were a bootstrapped company at that state phase. We were competing with people who sometimes had 30, 40, $50 million of funding. And a big part of that, everyone pays lip service to people being your most important asset, but then we outsource it to several, including, sometimes people completely outside of the company or even people within the company. My philosophy at that time is, like, I read every single resume that came in personally as the VP. That's unorthodox. Most people say that you shouldn't do that. Most people say you would do that. But at that stage, when we were super lean and kind of struggling to compete with better funded competitors, the most important thing was making sure that we could pick up those diamonds in the rough, because we couldn't compete with, you know, we lost all the time. We lose people to Uber or Google or Airbnb, like great candidates who really liked what we were doing and wanted to work for us. But at the end of the day, they took the better offer and we couldn't match that. So we had to find the real diamonds in the rough, people who wanted to break into the industry and had all the talent, and we're like, okay, there's going to be some managerial burden and all that. And systems and, filtering and AI really helps with getting through some of that. But that's actually some of the things I wonder how to adapt now. It's what I do, like, personally in my use of, using LLMs and things like that, is building agentic models that actually filter for that instead of filtering that out.
Let's double click on that because there's a lot of lean startups right now. And I actually think the human footprint inside a lot of these organizations is going to continue to look smaller and smaller. Is it an exceptional time to pick up talent and find hyperscalers, or is it the opposite?
Yeah, I think it depends on the phase of your company and what you're looking for. In a way, I think for Instapage and that part of that story, and also when I was, with Funnel Guard, the company that I founded and ran for 5 years,
Yeah,
the is a little bit of a blessing in disguise. 'Cause I think there's a common wisdom that I think is false. It's kind of like indexing on the wrong signals, where people think like, okay, you get some funding, and now it's time to go hire that kind of middle manager from Facebook or Snap or whatever. Spent most of my time in the marketing tech, so I'm thinking of big companies that people were liking to do there. But pick whatever company in your industry. There's just kind of like, oh, it's time to, now that we can have the budget, we can throw money at these people. And to some degree, I think we were spared of that for a long time at Instapage because we couldn't afford it because we were bootstrapped for most of that history. And at the phase of the company, I think that that was the right call. This is a part of it is like matching what are your actual needs, because in some ways, and you see this sometimes with founders too, right? It's different than taking a company from 1,000 to 1,000,000 than going from 0 to 1 or 1 to 10 or 10 to 100. I think sometimes people who have most of their experience and career at too high of a level can struggle at earlier stage companies in the same way that people coming out of earlier stage companies could struggle if they're put in that role at a bigger company. So I think part of
yeah.
that is just having, as a founder perspective, having the, spending the time to really think about like, okay, what are my needs now? And ideally, and this is where kind of the diamond in the rough thing comes into, in a lot of what gets missed in building early team is that ideally you're able to sift through and find the person who is exactly right for what you need at this stage and has kind of the first principles potential to actually grow into and ideally through most of that phase. Even the hyperscalers that we admire, they might have brought in an Eric Schmidt at Google, but they didn't fire everyone all the way down below and replace them with people from Yahoo, right? They had a talented group of people who had been in there in the garage phase, and they happened to be able to grow pretty much up until the point to IPO. Not everyone has that, does that or has that potential, but to dismiss it, I think, like arbitrarily is a huge mistake. I see a lot of founders at early stage. Oh, we got our Series A. Time to, bring in some adult supervision. And what you lose with that is, some of the companies that I help in executive expertise and growth help have that trouble. And that's exactly what they're saying. Sometimes, companies have gotten to the point where they have 1,500 employees and they're making hundreds of millions. And they're like, well, we don't have that culture that we had anymore. We don't have, it's all mercenaries or it's, no missionaries. Like, what do we do? Like, well, if we look at it, you kind of you filtered out the missionaries. I think that's one of the things that, more analytics and more data can help, like, not doing that. But it also, that's at a certain point, that just comes to like leadership philosophy and you have to kind of set the course as a founder.
A few points to pick up on what you shared. Like, A, we're seeing the talent wars, like whether it's Meta and OpenAI and, what they're paying for certain contracts and stealing. So I think that's still going on at certain sort of skill sets in a very meaningful way. I experienced that at Instapage later on, right?
So hard to, that's the devil's in the details there.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And where do you think that pressure comes from, right? Like, does that pressure come from investors? Does that come from that's the logical next step for a company? Like, it needs to turn into this other, form of the maturity curve?
Yeah, I think, I mean, to circle back to kind of that point we mentioned, like my background in the Marine Corps, I think maybe
Yeah.
tinted my view of this, especially, and then I also spent what's arguably a career before I even got in. I think I didn't get into tech until I was like 31, but I'd been a founder and an entrepreneur and been very like tech forward and things like that. And so I think for me, what I noticed is people conflate experience with valuable experience.
Hmm.
I said this was a perfect example of, you know, 2003 in the Marine Corps. By 2004, 2005, you had guys at the bottom of the rung who had as much or more combat experience and time in doing real world things than all of their leadership combined, right? Just because of the nature of things. The United States hadn't really been in a large scale thing since Desert Storm. And I think that's one of the weird, interesting lessons that I took all the way into tech is, years of experience. If you have 10 years of experience, that can be 10 years of experience, or it can be 1 year of the same year of experience over and over again with no growth or learning. Or in
Wow.
startups,
Yeah.
if you're doing it right, you can compress 20 years of experience in that 10 years or 15 years in 3 years. When it's top down, that's what we call crunch, right? And it's being forced on people who don't want to do it. But when that's intrinsic and bottoms up, And you want that compression because you want to grow in your career, and you want to hit those stratospheric levels in your career, then that's really powerful. People conflating, that level of value and experience is where we get the kind of adult supervision. And I think one of the tricks or issues with our industry is not in every case, but in a lot of cases, from the investor side, we have mostly MBAs who come from a finance background who have not necessarily like worked in a high growth company in that capacity, and or people who were founders and got really successful are in that space, and they understand what it takes, and so that's super valuable. And then on the founder side, maybe that changes a little bit now, but traditionally that's been a lot of very young founders who also haven't necessarily been at rungs of different companies and understood like the human management part of it and things like that. And so it kind of creates a perfect storm where we went through the bring in the adult supervision, and then people are like, oh no, companies that just don't understand what they're actually doing in the market and the value they're adding. And you have that kind of classic like Pepsi executives running Apple for a while. And then you can go the other direction where we've got and 22-year-olds who then create these billion-dollar companies. But I'm thinking of, dang, what was that healthcare company in like 2015 that just had flamed out really quickly in that scenario? But that kind of situation can happen on the other side as well. It's so damn hard. And my take, that's a smart founder, is trying to address that as much as all of the other problems in their company. And it's tough to filter. So there is pressure from, I think, VCs, or a lot of the VC motion is pattern matching and trying to repeat past success. And so that makes a lot of sense from that perspective to bring in the adult supervision, particularly if it's like, hey, this person was a great like C-level or VP at this another company that was within our portfolio. They've moved on. Let's bring them in and try to, repeat that. But this is where I kind of get a little philosophical, and I kind of lose people sometimes. Is I'll end up quoting or paraphrasing Dostoevsky or Karl von Clausewitz when it comes to like product management and tech. To paraphrase Dostoevsky, there's that famous quote of, all happy families are happy in the same way, but all dysfunctional families are dysfunctional in their own unique way. I
Mm,
invert that when I apply it to startups that I work with, where every startup more or less fails in the same way, but every successful startup succeeds in its own unique way. And so I think we can conflate that bringing in adult supervision means that someone's going to be able to just bring a playbook, but every startup exists in different time, in different markets, in different conditions. 10 years ago, AI or not, the hiring pool was going to be way different than it is today.
yeah.
You can't, so how much of that adult supervision is going to be relevant in a whole new world, and how much isn't? And that's the rub, right? That's I guess that's what it's tough.
When it works, right? I think we mostly hear about when it works, right?
Right.
And we don't hear about all of the times that it doesn't work, because most of those never make it to the light of day and they kind of burn out before. And you're right, like, I think we often take the same playbook and run it again and again. And whether it's coming from, investor pressure or for inside the organization, or even a founder feeling like, okay, I can't necessarily take this to the next level and I need to bring this type of tool set in. It's interesting. I really, really liked, Oliver, your compression comment, and not all experience is the same, because I think we look at tenure and we seem to say, okay, remember like job descriptions having like you need 5 years of experience, 10 years of experience. And I always thought that was ridiculous, right? A very simple example I always like to give is like going to the gym, right? Somebody can go to the gym for years and somebody could go to the gym for months, and they could have a very different body composition, a very different results package coming out of that, just depending on the intensity and what they do there. Going to the gym alone isn't, a skill or some sort of checkbox that you need to hit off.
To extend your metaphor, I'll say also, the DNA and makeup of your body matters. And I think
Yeah.
that's this is an interesting area where, Hatch Proof, I think, has some value into the context that I'm talking about as well. We get this in tech all the time, of all the biohackers and, health
Yeah.
maxers out there. That has its own set of problems, but you know, like I said, to extend your metaphor a little bit into the DNA of your company, into the makeup of your company, what is kind of possible with what you're trying to do and your structure. One of the things that I used to do, it wasn't really a company wide thing, but this is how I managed my teams at Instapage and as a founder, is I have two org charts. I have the org chart of the people who are at my company, and I have the org chart of all of the functions that they're doing. I essentially have an org chart for all of the hats that everyone's wearing. Where that doesn't go away as companies get bigger, especially as I've, been helping even some pretty big companies. A lot of companies I work for are kind of like seed to C,
Mm,
as far as stage and growth. So you get like some spectrums across there. I would say that it doesn't go away as you get bigger. It just kind of becomes like it goes below the surface, right? The tip of the iceberg no longer shows all the hats that people are wearing, the amount of kind of shadow work and shadow labor. Like we think we have shadow IT and, all these things that are happening in your company that are not maybe policy, but you also have a lot of things that people are just picking up slack on and doing that aren't on your org chart. And I think
yeah,
if there's a danger to, if there's a kind of like a postmodern like blowback to how the industry is doing layoffs because of I also we're kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater in some regards. And I think of this as just any company you've ever worked at, even my wife right now, if she has 3 or 4 projects that have nothing to do with her job description, and these are just things that someone needed to pick up the slack, right? And that's great that the people recognize it and all that. But if you were to look at from an org chart perspective and say, hey, we don't need this person or that person, you're not really aware of what everything they're doing. I like to reference the Rory Sutherland, the
yeah,
doorman fallacy, and it's
yeah,
I think one of the things that we're running into with maybe like blunt urges of headcount is we don't really understand what we're jettisoning that's been adding value, whether that's in the customer relations or even in operations.
yeah,
Any kind of insight, I think that's a tough one to untangle unless you're kind of walking the hallways kind of style of management, or you're a relatively small team. And so one of the things I used to do is I would talk to all the people I'm doing, like not just from my top down kind of VP level. I would create the, hey, here's all the people that we have in their jobs, but also create an org chart that has basically all the shadow like hat wearing that's going on that probably the other equivalent VPs or CEO or whoever has no idea is actually happening, but I would have that. And that would actually guide a lot of my hiring plan for the next quarter, for the next year, of being, all right, this person has like literally 5 or 6 hats and 3 of them are absolutely critical. And a bunch of them are not even really their job. And this other person maybe has 2, and that gives me a really good indicator of who are my stars and maybe who can absorb less capacity. Especially when I've had in the past where I've had stars who already have 4 hats, and I have to take like a hat off of someone who only has 3 and put it onto the person who has 5, just because their talent and work ethic for whatever reason is able to deliver on that many things. But also it's a priority as a manager of like these are the roles that I need to hire to remove the burden off of that. And I think that fits into, to tie it back to what our industry is going through right now. That's an area where I see a lot of potential value for the kind of semantic search and agentic workflows in AI to be able, if you have that kind of shadow org chart of all the hats and things that are going on, you can take a look at your systems and your processes and your operations and be like, all right, which of these are suitable to have be an agentic workflow? So maybe this person who is the best person on our team either isn't underappreciated and maybe let go in a riff, or at the same time, take some of the burden off that so they don't burn out and leave. And to be
I-
honest, that was like 80% of my job in the past was doing that. And I think that's something that I learned at 22 in the Marine Corps is
yeah.
troop welfare, lead from the front, and the do or die kind of managing up and internal politics, and in some cases, literally at that.
Well, there's so much of organizational design that comes from, the military and our understanding of command and control and how it flows through. And, I think back now and like the genesis for Hatchproof really came from my experience at Instapage. And it happened to do with seeing like alignment of executives and how it wasn't conducive for certain growth. And like we weren't able to surface some of those signals. And Oliver, to be honest, like we did reductions in force exit, and we did it with poor signals, right? We didn't have a sense of that shadow piece. And had we been continuing on and not had sort of an impending, outcome coming, it would have been very difficult to say we made the right decision with the folks that we did. And I wanted to be able to surface that with Hatchproof and really see the org in a different way, because all we've ever done is kind of match on skills,
Yeah,
and that's how we've brought people into an org. And the shift is going from ability to capability, right? What
absolutely.
can somebody do?
I think that understanding the kind of delta between your capabilities and your aspirations,
Yeah.
right? And then designing an organization and designing a company around like what plateaus, like we have the moonshot, but what needs to happen all the way along the way and what plateaus, right? And that changes, and that's where reorgs and things make sense. But having a clear view of that and doing it on signal is very hard to do. I think as my career has gone on, I'm less judgmental on on people who maybe make riffs and don't ignore it because it's hard. Hard things are hard. I mean, I make the argument that what your company is capable of doing and how it actually succeeds or dies has a lot to do with how it's structured and organized. And you can, when I do competitive intelligence, I do this for people all the time. This comes from my Intel background. Is if I look at, okay, is product under engineering? Is product under like a CRO?
Right.
Is all the various parts of this, like how is the company organized and structured? Who reports to who? Is kind of not just going to define what you do build, but what you're even capable of building. And
Yeah.
that's a whole other level of signal. Like I reverse engineer that to really be able to understand what competitors are capable of for people I work with and the companies I work at. And I think that's kind of my superpower, and that comes from nothing I ever learned in tech, but mostly what I learned in, I don't know, being trained in like post Cold War intelligence and insurgency intelligence that I brought. I think this is a little bit of that, putting a little bit of that DNA into intentionally designing your organization for the challenges to be able to go from ability of your people to capability of your company, and then how do you structure that to your aspirations and actually being able to get where you want to go. And that's the tough part. And I think that bring it full circle, I think that's the part where the kind of blunt way of dealing with it from a VC or an investor perspective is, hey, let's bring in adult supervision because they're going to do something. But that has to match so perfectly
Yeah.
to your market, your time, and where you're trying to be. That's hard.
Yeah. And most founders I've met actually deeply care about the people
Mm,
and deeply care. It's one of the functions that I see most often, that cultivating that team of excellence around the mission, they thrive in that. They want to do that. They want to do it. And so I think it's the ultimate tough decision when you have to do a riff, because you have to take this giant step back piece of it. We've got a tradition in the show at the end that we kind of ask the question of, do you say please and thank you?
I do.
You do.
Not for the LLM, but because I don't know, I was practice. I don't want to get in the habit of not thanking things that I talk to. I have a tendency, and for better or worse, we anthropomorphize our technology, and LLMs are no different. But we also anthropomorphize our pets, right? I'm talking to my dog or cat. I'm also nice and use manners, but that's for me, not necessarily for them.